The Galactic Council had been around for more than 12,000 years and nobody really questioned how things worked anymore, because that was just the way things were, and everyone accepted it without thinking too much about it. And the Council controlled 3 entire spiral arms of the galaxy, with 47 different alien species all working together in what they called perfect harmony, but was really just a very old and very tired system that nobody bothered to change because change was scary. And the unknown was scarier, and it was easier to keep doing what they had always done even if it wasn't the best way to do things anymore. When humanity's first faster-than-light ship called the Endeavour punched through the fabric of space near a mining colony called Septimus Prime, the galaxy barely noticed because new species showed up all the time, and most of them were pretty boring and followed the same patterns as everyone else, and the Council had seen it all before. Or at least they thought they had, but they were wrong about that. And they would learn just how wrong they were, but not yet, because first they had to meet the humans and decide they weren't important, and that would turn out to be the biggest mistake the galaxy had made in a very long time. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Endeavour with his crew of 200 people behind him, and he was nervous but trying not to show it, because captains weren't supposed to be nervous even when they were about to meet aliens for the first time in human history. And he straightened his uniform and cleared his throat and waited for the communication system to connect them with whatever was out there in the darkness of space, and he wondered if his children back on Earth would be proud of him or scared for him or both. The Vrelniks were tall and looked like insects, but with skin that seemed to be made of crystal, that reflected light in strange ways. And their diplomat was named Kelthar, and he spoke to the humans with a voice that sounded like wind chimes mixed with grinding glass, and the translation software turned it into words that Morrison could understand. But the tone was clear, even without translation, because Kelthar sounded bored and maybe a little annoyed, like he had been interrupted from something important to deal with something trivial, and that something trivial was humanity. Commander Lisa Harper was Morrison's second in command, and she had been in the military for 15 years, and she knew condescension when she heard it, and Kelthar was practically dripping with it as he explained to them in very simple terms, like he was talking to children, that the Galactic Council would allow humanity to join as probationary members in the lowest tier, alongside species that had barely figured out how to use fusion reactors. And she wanted to say something sharp and cutting, but Morrison gave her a look that said not now, and she bit her tongue and stayed quiet. Ambassador Richard Cole led the Earth delegation, and he was a diplomat through and through, which meant he could smile and nod and agree to things that made him angry inside, and never let anyone see that anger, because that was what diplomats did. And he accepted the Council's offer with grace and thanked them for their generosity, even though it wasn't generous at all. And he made mental notes about everything he saw and heard, because information was power, and Earth needed all the power it could get in this new galaxy they had stumbled into. The thing that the Galactic Council didn't understand, and probably couldn't understand because they had never experienced it themselves, was that humans had gotten to the stars the hard way, with no help from anyone, and no ancient libraries full of knowledge, and no friendly older species to show them the ropes, and every single breakthrough had been earned through sweat and blood and failure after failure after failure, until finally something worked, and then they built on that until the next failure. And then they tried again, and that kind of determination, that kind of refusal to quit even when quitting made sense, was something the galaxy had forgotten how to do. The Council updated their records with minimal fuss and filed humanity away under species classification Tier 5, which was basically the bottom of the barrel, and they noted that human technology was marginal at best, and that humans seemed emotionally unstable and prone to self-destructive behavior, which was a polite way of saying that humans took risks that no sane species would take, and the report recommended that humans not be given any important jobs, especially not in security or military roles, because they clearly couldn't be trusted with anything important. Morrison took the Endeavour back to Earth 3 months later, and he brought with him detailed scans of every piece of alien technology his ship had encountered, and he also brought recordings of every conversation and observation of every alien, custom and habit, because he knew that information would be valuable, and he was right about that, and when he arrived home, he was greeted as a hero. But he didn't feel like a hero because he had seen how the galaxy looked at humanity, and it wasn't with respect or even curiosity, but with dismissal and pity, like humans were pets that had learned a cute trick. Lisa Harper wrote a report that was 300 pages long, detailing everything she had observed about Galactic Council military capabilities, and she noted that their weapons were powerful but predictable, and their tactics were elegant, but rigid, and their ships were advanced but designed according to principles that nobody questioned anymore. And she concluded that the Council military was like a very sharp sword that had been polished so many times it was starting to wear thin, and nobody had noticed because they never had to use it against anything that fought back differently than they expected. Back on Earth, the news of first contact spread like wildfire, and people were excited and scared in equal measure, and governments argued about what it meant and what they should do next, and corporations saw opportunities for profit, and scientists saw opportunities for learning, and the military saw opportunities for new weapons, and everyone had an opinion, but nobody really knew anything because the galaxy was bigger and stranger than anyone had imagined, and humanity was just a tiny newcomer that nobody took seriously. Ambassador Cole gave a speech to the United Nations, and he told them the truth, which was that humanity had been placed at the bottom of the galactic hierarchy, and that the aliens thought humans were primitive and unstable and not worthy of respect. And there was anger at this news, and shame and determination, because humans had never liked being told they were inferior, and the response was typical of humanity, which was to roll up their sleeves and get to work, proving everyone wrong. The Galactic Council went back to their business and forgot about humanity almost immediately, because there were more important things to worry about, like trade disputes and border conflicts and the 1,000 tiny problems that came with managing a government that spanned light years and included dozens of species who all wanted different things, and humanity was just another file in an endless bureaucracy. And that was exactly what humanity needed, because being underestimated meant being left alone, and being left alone meant having time to prepare. 3 years had passed since humanity joined the Galactic Council, and in that time Earth had been busy learning and building and preparing for something they couldn't quite name, but felt coming like a storm on the horizon. And then the storm arrived, in the form of the Krell Dominion, which was a hive mind species from the Galactic Core that had been quiet for 600 years, and everyone had hoped they would stay quiet forever. But hope wasn't a strategy, and the Krell had emerged with 10,000 warships and a message that was crystal clear, which was submit or die, and there was no room for negotiation in those two options. The Galactic Council called an emergency meeting on Babylon Arch, which was a massive space station that floated in neutral territory and was supposed to be a symbol of peace and cooperation, but today it felt more like a funeral home where everyone had gathered to discuss their own demise and species. After species stood up to present their military capabilities and their defensive strategies and their ideas for negotiation, but the math was brutal and simple, and nobody wanted to say it out loud, but everyone was thinking it, which was that they were going to lose. The Terrellian fleet was considered the finest military force in the galaxy, and they had 3,000 ships equipped with plasma lances that could cut through asteroids like butter, and quantum shields that could deflect almost any known weapon, and their commander stood proud as he described their capabilities. But even he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes, because 3,000 ships against 10,000 was a losing proposition no matter how good your technology was. And everyone in the chamber knew it. The Ashkari Collective offered their psionic warriors, who were beings that could disrupt enemy computer systems with their minds alone, and cause enemy crews to see things that weren't there, and make tactical mistakes. But the Krell were a hive mind, and disrupting one node just made the others compensate, and the Ashkari representative sat down looking defeated before he had even finished his presentation. Dr. Alan Foster sat in the observer section with Lieutenant Commander Nicole Grant, and they watched the proceedings with growing frustration, because it was clear that the Council was going to lose, and nobody seemed willing to think outside the box or consider options that weren't in the standard military playbook. And Foster was a scientist, and scientists were trained to question everything, and he wondered why nobody was questioning whether the old ways of fighting were still the right ways, but he kept his mouth shut, because Earth was still just an observer, and observers didn't get to speak. The Council did the math, and came up with 8,000 ships if they combined every military vessel from every member species, and that was still 2,000 ships short of matching the Krell, and that didn't even account for the fact that the Krell had been preparing for war while the Council had been preparing for peace, and there was a big difference between those two types of preparation, and it showed in the grim faces around the chamber. Ambassador Cole stood up and asked for permission to speak, and there was a moment of silence because nobody expected the human to have anything useful to contribute, and then there were some suppressed laughs because the idea of humanity helping was almost absurd given that they had maybe 24 faster-than-light ships total, and most of those were cargo haulers and science vessels, not warships. But Cole ignored the laughter and said that Earth wished to contribute to the defense effort, and he said it with such seriousness that some of the laughter died away. Kelthar, who was now an ambassador himself and had grown even more dismissive of humanity over the past 3 years, waved one of his crystal claws in a gesture that clearly meant go away, and he said that Earth's 24 ships would be more useful evacuating the human homeworld than fighting in a battle they couldn't possibly survive. And he said it kindly, like he was doing humanity a favor by telling them to run away and save themselves, while the real species handled the real problems. What Kelthar didn't know, and what none of the council knew, was that Captain Morrison had spent 3 years scanning and analyzing every piece of galactic technology he encountered, and he had sent all that data back to Earth where thousands of scientists and engineers had been studying it and reverse engineering it and asking a question that the galaxy had stopped asking, which was what if we did this differently, and that question was about to change everything. Earth's response to the Krell threat wasn't to build ships that matched Council specifications or to train soldiers in Council tactics, but to ask what humans were good at, and the answer was innovation, born from desperation and the willingness to try things that seemed crazy, because crazy sometimes worked when sensible failed. And the past 3 years had been spent turning every wild idea into a prototype, and every prototype into a weapon. Colonel Danny Hayes stood in the command center of Earth's orbital defense station, looking at screens filled with data and proposals and designs, and he had been tasked with turning Earth's military from a planetary defense force into something that could fight in space, and he had done it by ignoring every rule the Council had about proper warfare, because the Council's rules were designed for a type of war that humanity had never fought, and probably never would. The galaxy had rules about warfare that had developed over thousands of years, and everyone followed these rules because they worked, and they were elegant, and they made sense, and energy weapons were preferred because they were clean and precise, and shields operated on specific frequencies that everyone knew, and faster-than-light travel followed predictable quantum pathways that made strategic planning possible, and battles were fought like chess games, where both players knew all the moves and the best tactician won. Humans had been in space for less than a century, and they had no rules and no traditions and no interest in elegant solutions, when brutal ones worked better, and Colonel Hayes had taken that philosophy and built an entire military doctrine around, which wasn't really a doctrine at all but more like organized chaos with weapons attached. Dr. Karen Mills worked in a converted asteroid facility that had become humanity's primary weapons research station, and she had a team of 300 scientists from every nation on Earth, and they worked around the clock, and they didn't sleep much, and they drank too much coffee, and they argued constantly about physics and engineering and whether something was possible, but they always came back to the same conclusion, which was that possible was just another word for we haven't figured out how yet. The first weapon Mills developed was a missile that didn't carry explosives, but instead carried compressed matter designed to destabilize enemy shields by introducing quantum uncertainty, which was a fancy way of saying it made reality wobble in ways that shields couldn't compensate for, and the Galactic Council had theorized about such weapons decades ago, but abandoned the idea because the weapons were unpredictable and might not work, and the Council didn't like unpredictable, but humans had made 3,000 of them in 2 months because unpredictable was better than nothing. Lieutenant Sophie Chen was testing the railgun batteries, which were weapons that accelerated solid projectiles to a significant fraction of light speed using electromagnetic force, and the Galactic Council had used kinetic weapons centuries ago, but moved beyond them because energy weapons were more sophisticated, and everyone agreed that sophistication was better. But nobody had asked whether sophisticated was actually more effective, and Chen's tests showed that a tungsten rod moving at 40,000 kilometers per second didn't care how sophisticated your shields were. Admiral George Walker reviewed Earth's fleet composition with Captain Morrison, and the numbers were honestly embarrassing by Council standards because they had 147 ships total, and most of them were converted civilian vessels, and cargo haulers with weapons bolted onto them, and science ships carrying experimental technologies that might explode if used incorrectly. and the passenger liner Aurora had been turned into a carrier for small attack craft, and every pilot was a volunteer who understood the odds and volunteered anyway. The real surprise was a ship called the Archimedes, which was humanity's first purpose-built warship, and it had been constructed in secret over the past 3 years, in a shipyard hidden in the asteroid belt, and it incorporated every piece of alien technology Earth had reverse-engineered combined with human innovations that the galaxy would never have considered. And its main weapon was something new, which was a directed quantum destabilization beam that could age enemy ships centuries in seconds. Ambassador Cole sent another message to the Galactic Council saying that humanity respectfully declined evacuation and would stand with the Council against the Krell threat, and the response was sympathetic, but dismissive, and the Tyrellians even offered Earth 3 outdated cruisers as a gesture of goodwill, because they assumed humans wouldn't know how to operate them effectively. But they were wrong about that, just like they were wrong about everything else concerning humanity. The galaxy had spent thousands of years developing very specific ideas about how warfare should work, and these ideas had become so deeply embedded in galactic culture that nobody questioned them anymore, and energy weapons were the standard because they were precise and clean and could be calibrated to specific frequencies, and shields operated on quantum principles that everyone understood, and faster-than-light travel followed predictable patterns that made strategic planning possible, and battles were fought with an elegance that was almost artistic, like watching a carefully choreographed dance where everyone knew the steps. Humans had been fighting each other for their entire history, and had developed absolutely no sense of elegance or propriety when it came to warfare, and their philosophy was simple, which was that the only rule in war was to win, and everything else was just details, and they had no traditions to honor and no doctrine to follow and no respect for doing things the proper way, when the improper way might work better. And this made them dangerous in ways the galaxy couldn't understand, because the galaxy had forgotten that war wasn't supposed to be elegant. It was supposed to be effective. Commander Peter Blake stood in the converted asteroid facility that had become the center of human weapons development, and around him hundreds of scientists and engineers worked on projects that would have made the Galactic Council's military advisors either laugh or run away in terror, and probably both, and Blake watched as Dr. Karen Mills presented the latest batch of quantum uncertainty missiles, which now numbered over 3,000. And each one was basically a small bomb that made reality stop making sense in a very localized area. The Galactic Council had considered weapons like this decades ago, and their military scientists had run simulations and determined that yes, such weapons were theoretically possible, but they were also unpredictable and might not work consistently, and there was a 5% chance they could destabilize and destroy the ship that fired them, and the Council had decided that 5% was too risky and had abandoned the entire concept, but humans looked at that same 5% and decided it was an acceptable risk, if it meant having a weapon that enemy shields couldn't stop. Lieutenant Sophie Chen stood in the railgun testing facility, which was basically a long tunnel in space where they could fire projectiles without hitting anything important, and she watched as another tungsten rod accelerated to incredible speed. And she checked the readings and smiled because the math was beautiful, even if the weapon was brutal. And the Galactic Council had moved beyond kinetic weapons centuries ago because they considered them primitive and unsophisticated. But Chen didn't care about sophisticated, she cared about effective. The thing about kinetic weapons that the galaxy had forgotten was that they were simple, and simple meant reliable, and reliable meant they worked every time without fail. And a solid tungsten rod didn't care about shield frequencies or energy dampening, fields or quantum interference, because it was just mass moving very fast, and when mass moving very fast hit something, that something broke. And it was physics at its most basic, and there was no defense against it except not getting hit. And that was harder than it sounded. Admiral George Walker stood on the bridge of the Archimedes, which was floating in space near Mars, and he looked at the ship's specifications with a mixture of pride and worry, because the Archimedes was powerful, but it was also completely untested in real combat, and its main weapon was based on theoretical physics that might not work the way the scientists thought it would, and if it failed, then humanity's secret advantage would disappear, and they would be left with just the railguns and missiles and converted cargo ships. Captain Morrison joined Walker on the bridge, and together they reviewed the fleet composition. And it was honestly pathetic by galactic standards because most of the ships were civilian vessels that had been retrofitted with weapons. And the weapons themselves were often experimental and might explode or malfunction or simply not work. And the crews were mostly volunteers who had basic training but no real combat experience. And on paper it looked like a disaster waiting to happen. But Morrison had learned something important over the past 3 years, which was that paper didn't win wars, people did. The Aurora had been a passenger liner designed to carry wealthy tourists between Earth and Mars, and now it was a carrier for 200 small attack craft, and each craft was piloted by a volunteer who understood basic math, and basic math said that most of them wouldn't come back, and they volunteered anyway because that was what humans did when facing extinction, and the other species in the galaxy couldn't understand that kind of determination, because they had never faced extinction. Or if they had, it was so long ago they had forgotten what it felt like. Dr. Alan Foster worked in the science section of the Archimedes running final tests on the quantum destabilization beam, and the theory was solid, which was that you could target the quantum field that held matter together and destabilize it in such a way that time would accelerate locally and a ship that was 1 second old could suddenly become 10,000 years old. And its hull would corrode, and its systems would fail, and its crew would die. And it was horrifying and brutal, and exactly the kind of weapon that the Galactic Council would never develop, because it violated so many ethical guidelines that Foster had stopped counting. Lieutenant Commander Nicole Grant coordinated the attack craft squadrons from the Aurora, and she had 200 pilots under her command, and they were all young and eager and scared, and she remembered being young and eager and scared herself, and she gave them the same advice her own commander had given her years ago, which was to trust their training and trust their instincts. And don't think too hard about the odds, because thinking about the odds would just make you freeze. The human fleet had 147 ships, and they ranged from the powerful but untested Archimedes to converted cargo haulers that could barely maintain their shields. And if the Galactic Council had seen the fleet, they would have laughed, or cried, or both, because it looked like something cobbled together by desperate people who didn't know what they were doing. And that assessment would have been accurate, except for one thing, which was that desperate people who didn't know what they were doing sometimes came up with solutions that experts would never consider. Commander Blake's ship was called the Resilience, and it had been a cargo hauler that transported mining equipment before being converted into a warship, and its railguns were powerful, but it only had enough ammunition for maybe 20 shots, and its shields were barely adequate, and its engines were older than some of the crew. But Blake loved it anyway because it was his, and his crew trusted him, and together they would make it work somehow. The Tyrellian fleet had sent Earth 3 outdated cruisers as a gift, and the Tyrellians expected that humans would struggle to operate them, because the controls were designed for Tyrellian physiology, and the systems were complex, and the tactical displays used Tyrellian logic, which was different from human logic. But human engineers had spent 2 weeks studying the ships, and then completely rewired them and reprogrammed them, and now they operated on human logic and human controls, and the Tyrellians would have been insulted if they knew, but they didn't know, and that was probably for the best. Admiral Walker sent a final message to Earth before the fleet departed for the Arcturus Gate, where the Krell were expected to arrive, and the message was simple, which was that humanity would do its best, and its best might not be enough, but they would try anyway because trying was what humans did. And back on Earth, billions of people watched the fleet depart, and they prayed or hoped or just crossed their fingers, because faith took many forms, but it all meant the same thing, which was please, let them come home. The human fleet jumped to faster than light speed and left the solar system behind, and they traveled for 3 days through quantum space, which was a strange place where normal physics didn't quite work right, and some of the crew got sick, and others got philosophical, and Morrison walked through the ship talking to everyone and reminding them why they were doing this and who they were protecting. And by the time they arrived at Arcturus Gate, the crew was ready, or as ready as anyone could be for what was coming. The Galactic Council fleet was already there when the humans arrived, and it was an impressive sight with 8,000 ships arranged in perfect formation called the Wall of Unity, which was a defensive strategy that had been used successfully for centuries, and every ship knew its place, and every weapon was calibrated, and every shield was synchronized, and it was beautiful and elegant, and almost certainly doomed, because elegance didn't win wars. The human fleet took up position on the far side of the Council formation, almost as an afterthought because the Council's battle plans had humans listed as auxiliary support, which was a polite way of saying they weren't important enough to be part of the main strategy. And Admiral Walker looked at the formation and shook his head because he knew what was coming. And he knew the Council didn't, and he felt bad about that. But not bad enough to warn them, because they probably wouldn't listen. Anyway, the Krell fleet emerged from quantum space exactly where the Council's analyst had predicted they would, which was at the Arcturus Gate. And it was like watching a wall of darkness appear in the void of space because there were 10,000 ships, and each one was massive, and they moved in perfect geometric formations because they were all controlled by a single hive mind consciousness, and that consciousness was ancient and patient and absolutely certain of victory. The Galactic Council fleet responded exactly as their doctrine dictated, with long-range energy weapons, firing in synchronized patterns, and quantum missiles following predetermined attack vectors, and it was a textbook opening to a battle that had been refined over thousands of years, and every species knew their role and executed it perfectly, and the Tyrellian commander felt confident because confidence came from doing things the right way, and this was definitely the right way. The Krell shields absorbed the Council's attacks with disturbing efficiency, and the hive mind analyzed each incoming weapon and adjusted shield frequencies in real time, and within minutes the Krell had adapted to 70% of the Council's weapons, and within an hour they had adapted to 90%, and the Council kept firing and the Krell kept adapting, and it was like watching someone try to break down a door by knocking politely. Commander Peter Blake watched from the bridge of the Resilience as Council ships started dying, and they died in ones and twos at first, and then in groups of 10 and 20, and the Krell pressed forward in their geometric patterns, and the hive mind felt no fear and no hesitation, and no doubt because those were emotions, and the Krell had left emotions behind millions of years ago, and Blake wondered if that made them stronger or weaker, but he knew the answer would come soon enough. The first hour of battle ended with the Council having lost 300 ships, and the Krell having lost less than 50. And the math was brutal and simple, and everyone could see where this was going, and some of the Council ships began to pull back, not in retreat but in reorganization. And Admiral Walker knew that reorganization was just another word for panic, and panic was contagious, and if the Council started to break, then everything would fall apart. Admiral Walker gave the order that humanity had been waiting for, and he said it calmly like he was ordering coffee instead of unleashing chaos, and the order was Protocol Chaos, which was a name that made the human crews smile because it was so perfectly human to name a military strategy after the thing that everyone else tried to avoid. And across the human fleet, captains repeated the order, and weapons came online, and engines powered up, and 147 ships prepared to show the galaxy what humans did best. The human fleet broke formation and scattered, and to the Galactic Council it looked like the humans were panicking or retreating, or just had no idea what they were doing. And the Tyrellian fleet commander sent an urgent message telling the human ships to maintain formation, because breaking formation was suicide, and Walker received the message and ignored it, because suicide was in the eye of the beholder. The first railgun volley hit a Krell battlecruiser, and the solid tungsten rods punched through shields that were designed to stop energy weapons, and the rods were moving so fast that they didn't just penetrate the hull, they went completely through the ship and out the other side, and the battlecruiser buckled and twisted and then exploded. And the Krell hive mind paused for exactly 3 seconds trying to understand what had just happened, because this wasn't in any of their tactical databases. Captain Morrison commanded the Endeavour II, which was named after the ship that had made first contact, and it was faster and meaner than its predecessor, and Morrison ordered the quantum uncertainty missiles fired, and 12 missiles streaked toward the Krell fleet, and when they detonated, the Krell shields across an entire sector flickered and failed because reality itself had become unstable, and shields needed stable reality to function, and the Krell tried to adapt. But you can't adapt to reality not making sense. Lieutenant Sophie Chen piloted a fast attack craft called Hunter 7, and she led a squadron of 12 ships directly into the Krell formation, weaving between the massive alien vessels at speeds that would have killed any other species because the G-forces were brutal, and Chen's vision went gray at the edges and her body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. But she had trained for this, and humans were stubborn, and her ship held together, and so did she. The Council species had evolved on lower gravity worlds and their bodies couldn't handle the acceleration that humans could take, and the Vrelniks would have shattered like glass and the Ashkari bones would have snapped like twigs. But humans had evolved on a planet that was trying to kill them, and high gravity was just another challenge, and Chen's squadron deployed plasma mines, not in predictable patterns, but scattered randomly, because random meant the hive mind couldn't predict where they were, and prediction was what the Krell relied on. The Archimedes moved forward like a predator that had been waiting for the right moment, and Dr. Alan Foster activated the quantum destabilization beam, and a lance of impossible energy struck the Krell flagship, and the galaxy witnessed something it had never seen before, which was a ship aging 10,000 years in 10 seconds, and the hull corroded and the systems failed, and the crew died, and time itself had become a weapon. Commander Nicole Grant released 200 small attack craft from the Aurora, and each one carried a human pilot and a payload of weapons that the Galactic Council had banned or deemed too dangerous or simply never thought to create. And there were black hole generators designed to last only seconds before collapsing, and antimatter bombs, with yields that violated several treaties, and nanotechnology that could disassemble enemy ships molecule by molecule. The Krell tried to adapt, but adaptation required pattern recognition, and human tactics had no patterns, and ships that should have retreated pressed forward, and weapons that should have been exhausted were supplemented by improvised alternatives. And when the Resilience ran out of railgun ammunition, Commander Blake ordered his crew to load the escape pods into the launchers and fire them at enemy vessels, and each pod had been modified to explode on impact, because if you were going to die anyway, you might as well take someone with you. The battle became chaos in its purest form, and the Galactic Council watched in shock as the humans fought with no regard for proper tactics or military doctrine, and they used weapons that were insane and strategies that were suicidal, and somehow it was working because the Krell were dying faster than they could adapt, and the hive mind was experiencing something it hadn't felt in millions of years, which was confusion. A Krell destroyer tried to target the Archimedes, but 3 human attack craft intercepted it, and they didn't fire weapons, they just rammed it at full speed. And the destroyer's shields were designed to stop energy weapons, not mass delivered at relativistic speeds, and the shield generators overloaded, and the destroyer went dark and drifted helpless into a field of plasma mines that Chen's squadron had scattered. The Tyrellian commander watched the human assault with something approaching horror, because everything the humans did violated fundamental principles of warfare, and they had no formation and no organization, and no apparent regard for their own survival. But they were winning, and that shouldn't have been possible, but it was happening right in front of him, and he realized that the galaxy had forgotten something important, which was that rules only matter if everyone follows them. The second hour of battle ended with the Krell having lost over 1,000 ships, and the tide had turned, and the hive mind knew it, and the Krell had never retreated before in their entire history because retreat required admitting defeat, and the hive mind didn't understand defeat, but it understood mathematics, and the mathematics said that continuing this battle would result in total annihilation. Admiral Walker watched as the Krell fleet began to pull back, and he wanted to pursue, but his fleet was damaged and depleted, and they had lost 91 ships, which meant 23,000 people who would never go home, and he felt the weight of every single one of those deaths, but he also felt pride because those people had died saving the galaxy, and that meant something. The Krell jumped to quantum space and vanished, and they left behind 3,000 destroyed vessels and a galaxy that would never look at warfare the same way again, and the Council fleet floated in the aftermath surrounded by debris and bodies, and the evidence that everything they thought they knew about fighting was wrong. Commander Blake sat in the captain's chair of the Resilience, which had survived against all odds, and he looked at his crew, who were exhausted and injured and traumatized, but also alive. And he said the only thing that made sense, which was that they had done it, and his crew nodded because words weren't enough for what they had just experienced. The Battle of Arcturus Gate was over, and humanity had lost almost 2/3 of its fleet. But the galaxy had survived, and the price had been paid in human blood and human sacrifice, and the Galactic Council would spend years trying to understand what had happened, but the answer was simple, which was that humans fought differently because they had always fought differently, and that difference had saved them all. The aftermath of the battle left the galaxy in a state of shock that went beyond simple surprise or disbelief, because what they had witnessed challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare and technology, and their place in the universe. And the Galactic Council convened again on Babylon Arch. But the atmosphere in the chamber was completely different now, because the species that had dismissed humanity 3 years ago were now looking at them with expressions that mixed awe and fear and respect and maybe a little bit of shame. Ambassador Kelthar stood before the council, and his crystalline exoskeleton bore scars from the battle where his ship had been hit by debris from a destroyed Krell vessel, and he had survived, but many of his crew had not. And he spoke with a voice that no longer carried condescension, but instead carried something that sounded almost like humility. And he said that the council owed humanity an apology, and their gratitude, and every species in the chamber knew he was right, even if saying it out loud was difficult. Ambassador Richard Cole stood to address the council, and his face showed the weight of Earth's losses, because 23,000 people was a number that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and each one of those people had been someone's child or parent or friend, and they had died far from home fighting for a galaxy that had barely acknowledged their existence. And Cole spoke quietly, but his words carried across the chamber, and he said that humanity hadn't saved the council because they were better, but because they were different. The difference was important, and Cole explained it carefully, because he wanted the galaxy to understand what had happened and why it had happened, and he told them that the council had 12,000 years of peace and refinement and building upon inherited knowledge, while humanity had nothing but struggle and conflict and the need to innovate or die. And the council had learned to fight with precision and elegance. But humans had learned to fight to survive. And survival didn't care about elegance. The council's military commanders presented their analysis of human tactics, and the report was 3,000 pages long and filled with diagrams and statistics and technical breakdowns, but it all came down to a few simple truths, which were that humans fought differently because they thought differently, and they weaponized things that the council had deemed too dangerous or too unpredictable or too insane, and they turned disadvantages into strategies and refused to accept that anything was impossible. The report noted with a mixture of fascination and alarm that humans had used 73 different weapon types during the battle, and 41 of those weapons had been invented in the 8 months since the Krell threat had emerged, and that kind of innovation speed was unprecedented in galactic history, because the Council's weapon development cycles were measured in years or decades, not months, and the analysts didn't know whether to be impressed or terrified, and eventually they settled on both. Dr. Alan Foster presented Earth's scientific findings to the Council's researchers, and he brought with him detailed specifications for every weapon humanity had used, and he explained the theories behind them, and the Council scientists listened with growing understanding, because Foster showed them that humans had taken galactic technology and asked a question the galaxy had stopped asking thousands of years ago, which was, what if we did it differently? The quantum destabilization beam had come from a theoretical physics paper published by a graduate student in Moscow who was 23 years old and had no formal training in quantum mechanics, but had read some council research papers and thought they were missing something obvious, and it turned out he was right. And his weapon had destroyed the Krell flagship and probably saved the battle, and the council scientists were humbled because they had access to all the same information, but had never thought to question it. The railguns were even more embarrassing for the council, because they were based on 19th century Earth technology that humanity had simply scaled up to space warfare, and the council had abandoned kinetic weapons centuries ago as primitive. But primitive didn't mean ineffective. And a tungsten rod moving at relativistic speeds was just as deadly as any energy weapon, and had the advantage of being impossible to adapt to, because physics was physics. Captain Jake Morrison stood with the surviving members of his crew, and they had all been promoted because Earth needed leaders who understood space combat, and Morrison was now an admiral, whether he wanted the title or not. And beside him stood Lieutenant Commander Nicole Grant and Commander Peter Blake and Dr. Karen Mills and Lieutenant Sophie Chen, and they had all become symbols of something the galaxy needed to understand. The thing they symbolized wasn't superhuman ability or technological genius, but something simpler and more fundamental, which was the refusal to accept defeat and the willingness to try anything no matter how crazy it seemed, and the determination to keep fighting even when the odds said you should give up, and these were uniquely human traits born from a history of struggle that the Council species had never experienced. The Galactic Council voted unanimously to reclassify humanity, And the vote was almost ceremonial because everyone knew what the result would be. And humanity was elevated to Tier 1 status, with full council membership, and unrestricted access to all galactic technology and knowledge, and some species grumbled about how fast the elevation was, but nobody grumbled too loudly, because humanity had earned it in blood. But more than just elevation, the council made an unprecedented request, which was that Earth establish a military academy to teach other species how to think like humans, and how to embrace chaos, and how to innovate under pressure. And this was a remarkable thing because the council was essentially admitting that their way of doing things was flawed, and that they needed to learn from a species they had dismissed as primitive just 3 years ago. Admiral George Walker prepared to take the human fleet home, and he looked at the ships that remained, and each one was damaged and scarred, and carried the bodies of crew members who hadn't survived, and the journey back to Earth would be somber. But Walker felt something other than grief, and he realized it was pride, because his people had done something impossible, and proved something important. The important thing they had proved was that humanity wasn't stronger or smarter or more advanced than the galactic species, but they had shown the galaxy what it had forgotten over thousands of years of peace, which was that survival rewarded, the solution that worked, not the solution that was elegant, and that sometimes the best strategy was to throw out the strategy book and improvise. The Krell would return someday, and everyone knew it because hive minds didn't give up. They just regrouped and adapted and came back stronger. But when they returned, they would find a galaxy that had changed, and the council species were already beginning to think differently and question old assumptions and develop new weapons and tactics, and all of it came from what humanity had taught them at Arcturus Gate. Admiral Morrison walked through the Archimedes one last time before they departed, and he visited the medical bay where injured crew members were recovering, and he visited the memorial wall where names of the dead were being engraved, and he visited the engineering section where teams were working to keep the damaged ship running, and everywhere he went he saw people who had done the impossible because someone had asked them to. The human fleet formed up for the jump to Earth, and as they powered their faster-than-light drives, the Galactic Council fleet formed an honor corridor, and over 1,000 alien ships positioned themselves in 2 long lines, creating a path for the humans to travel through, and every species transmitted the same message in every language. And the message was simple but profound, which was that humanity had earned their respect and their gratitude and their place among the stars. Admiral Walker gave the order to jump, and the human fleet entered quantum space and began the 3-day journey home. And as they traveled, the crew had time to think about what they had accomplished and what it meant, and some cried and some celebrated, and some just slept because they were exhausted beyond words. But they all understood that something fundamental had changed. Earth received the fleet as heroes, and billions of people gathered to watch the ships return, and there were parades and ceremonies and speeches. But the returning crews were quiet, because they had seen things that civilians couldn't understand, and lost friends that civilians had never met, and heroism felt different when you were the one being called a hero, versus when you were the one doing the fighting. The galaxy had learned its lesson about underestimating humanity, and they had learned it the hard way through battle and death and sacrifice, and the cost had been high, but the lesson had been learned, and the council would never again dismiss a species based on their technology level or their age or their apparent primitiveness, because primitive was just another word for different, and different could be powerful. Humanity had learned something too, which was that they were no longer alone in the universe, and that they had something valuable to contribute to the galactic community. And that contribution wasn't just military strength, but a way of thinking, and a willingness to question everything, and an absolute refusal to give up even when giving up made logical sense.